Just before I open it up to questions here and also from those following this online, and I do hope we have in our time available to us as wide a range of contributions as possible, including, if I could particularly encourage any representatives of governments or donors who might be here to have that perspective as well. You know who you are, as I say. Right, we have, well, about 50, up to another 50, 55 minutes, but that's the maximum because excuse the pun, it will eat into time for refreshments as well. So can I, just before we open it up, ask specifically James Shaw Hamilton, the Director of the Humanitarian Forum, for some comments. James.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the paper as well. There are a couple of other areas that I wonder whether it's worth developing on. The material support rules are extraordinary because they are so vague, but they're also very visible. The rules about the financing of terrorism are equally vague, but are also much more invisible. And the prejudgment that there is in those, and the self-censorship as well, by the NGOs is extraordinary. So the way that the rules on financing of terrorism have been created and applied by various different intergovernmental organisations, but in a sense in a rather hidden way, is interesting, as are the ways that those rules have been used by governments in various different parts of the world who, for other reasons, don't like their civil society. So, in a sense, there's been a very willing audience to take these counter-terrorism rules and adopt them for their own internal purposes. But also the way that the regulation of international aid has effectively been delegated to organisations that perhaps aren't very well able to do it, like banks perhaps, or lawyers, or list-checking organisations, which again I think has an enormous impact on the way aid can be delivered now, but also can be delivered in the future. Another example of the self-censorship, I think, is the fear, certainly by those banks, but also by individual organisations, at the way they'll be treated by the media, or the way that they would be potentially subject to not just criminal, but also civil litigation in the States. So several UK charities have been forced to move their bank accounts because of fear by those banks at litigation in civil courts in America. And there's a nice example where a UK charity was not able to transfer money to its US lawyers because of these financing of terrorism rules. And this has an impact, obviously, in Somalia and Pakistan and so on, as the panelists were saying, but also I think in the predictable disaster that there will be in Yemen fairly soon, in the assumptions about how we can carry on getting aid from Gulf donors. They aren't the sort of indifferent, empty, deep pockets that perhaps the World Food Programme and others might like them to be. And so it's those hidden problems, and in a sense it's not 10 years since 9/11 and this is the end. It's perhaps a new era of humanitarian work that the debate really needs to change, and the organisations that have been, I suppose, quite relaxed at these, the hiddenness of these rules need to become much more vocal.
James, thank you very much indeed, and I know that you helped to inform the research that went into this report anyway, so thank you for that. Can I also invite one more specific contribution at this point? It's from Arnild Spence of the Norwegian Refugee Council, which has also, as an NGO, been taking an active interest in the counter-terrorism issue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organising this meeting and for issuing this very important piece of work. I would like to just talk briefly on why this subject affects the Norwegian Refugee Council in our operations, and also to give a little insight in the discussion that's happening at the interagency level in Geneva, New York, Rome and elsewhere on this topic. since the beginning of this year, NRC has been quite central, together with ODI and a number of partners represented here today, in setting the issue of counterterrorism on the agenda of the Interagency Standing Committee on Humanitarian Affairs, which is the main body developing policies and positions on humanitarian space issues. And the reason NRC is affected, my organization is affected, is that we specialize in trying to get access to areas where non-state armed groups are active and where we need to engage with them. And examples are South Central Somalia and Mogadishu, obviously, as long as Al-Shabaab were in control there. Other examples are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the occupied Palestinian territories. Our experience from Somalia is that it has been possible to work there for us since 2006 when we started, in a way that is based on acceptance amongst the local power holders. And we've been able to obtain this acceptance through building trust with all the local power holders, including Al-Shabaab. And what we've proven is that we are able to do this in a principled way as long as we stick to our principles and we do not accept any terms imposed by such groups. We shall also need to not be dictated by terms of donors. So, for example, as we don't accept any attempts by Al-Shabaab or any other groups to impose taxes on us, to select our beneficiaries, or to distribute aid for us. Equally, we do not accept when donors say, well, we impose a counter-terrorism clause to this agreement. We will reject that, and normally, or in several cases, we have come to an agreement with donors, because donors are also trying to overcome the issue. And I think what's interesting about the recent development in Somalia is that the severity of this crisis has made certain donors reconsider and have made attempts to lift some of the restrictions, and we should put some more effort into trying to interpret this. What does it imply? Is it the severity of the crisis? Is it the fact that it's a famine, that it's a regional crisis and so on, that has prompted this, or are there other factors? Because that will be important in terms of how we take that forward, whether more can be done in terms of advocacy to make more general exemptions. Now, just a few comments on the policy brief. I think it's a very useful overview of the counter-terrorism legislation and other measures. The review of how the counter-terrorism measures materialize for humanitarian actors tally really well with the discussions that we've had at the interagency level. The discussion at the interagency level shows that the conditions in funding agreements is a principal type of restriction that are faced by most of the organizations that have engaged in our discussion. And very similar to what this report has disclosed, it's contractual counter-terrorism clauses, the vetting requirements, and the restrictions on indirect support and contact with listed persons and organizations that most organizations are faced with increasingly. When it comes to the prohibition and criminalization of direct and indirect support, our own analysis at the interagency level has come to the same conclusion as this research, namely that it's not primarily something that materializes in terms of legal persecution, but rather the effect it has on humanitarian organizations is deterrence, risk aversion, and uncertainty concerning the scope of material support and whether our assistance programs could be defined as such. And interestingly, key governments that we have talked to informally are rather reluctant to issue any explanatory notes on how we should interpret it. Rather, it is left to humanitarian organizations themselves to interpret the scope of the legislation and to ensure that we are in compliance. Now, just to touch briefly on the conclusions of the paper, NRC...
Just very briefly, if you would, yes.
Yes, very briefly.
Yeah.
NRC certainly agrees that we need to formulate our demands as a humanitarian community of states in order to reduce negative impacts on principled humanitarian actions. And we think that states themselves could also take a number of measures, including to have more consistent humanitarian exemptions to their legislation, to amend contractual counter-terrorism clauses in funding agreements, and also to remove partner vetting requirements. And we would like to enter into a collective conversation with a number of governments. And for that, as this paper rightly points out, also the humanitarian community on their side needs to come together and define their collective positions and demands. Thank you.
And Spence, thank you very much indeed. But one quick question then we must ask you, I think, because of what we heard from Jahangir about the Kenyan operation in Somalia at the moment, and that in the aftermath of it, considerations being given to providing some sort of military umbrella now for the delivery of aid into South Central Somalia. What would you think of that, given what you've just told us?
My organization has engaged quite actively recently in the discussion of whether humanitarian aid can be better provided in South Central Somalia through military means and the use of military assets. And we are strongly opposed to that. We don't see any humanitarian benefit whatsoever of introducing military assets, especially when the military assets in question, particularly AMISOM, is considered on the ground to be party to the conflict. And also, if you look at the practicality of getting the aid to the people in South Central Somalia, the most needy people are in very remote villages. They are not in the main cities whereby you could reach them through a humanitarian corridor. Right. So both in practical terms and in terms of the destabilizing effect it would have in the local operating environments, we think it's a very bad idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, and we open it up. What I'm going to do is, if you could keep comments, questions very brief, and also I think we'll take 2 or 3 together. It'll be the best way to handle it at this time. So.
Sorry, can I just add, there's also Samira Al-Hawari and Vicky Metcalf for also co-authors of the report, and they can also answer some of the questions.
Also answer, yes, we'll come back with answers a little bit later on. Start with you, Tariq.
Khalid Nadeem, Citation Middle East Forum. This is a question for Jahangir Malik from the Islamic Relief. Which extra steps do you think you have to take in the counter-terrorism legislation, specifically dealing with Pakistan and Afghanistan, which put you at a disadvantage, say, another charity like Oxfam or MSF? So, I mean, the extra costs, the extra time involved in dealing with the issue, and how does it put you at a disadvantage, you think, to other charities and NGOs?
Good, Khalid, thanks very much indeed. I'll take one with that.
Aisha Singh, Humanitarian Consultant. I suppose I'd be very interested to have more of a sort of understanding of what kind of follow-up is taking place in terms of dialogue and advocacy across the sector. I mean, there have been a number of initiatives that have taken place in terms of looking at remote management, modalities of remote management and how that could be more accountable, codes of conduct by NGOs in Somalia, and how they can look at what principles they would abide by and therefore front up to donors at the Somalia end. Humanitarian Forum has been doing some work. You've done this report, you've talked about YASC going forward and so on. So to get more of an idea of what exactly is happening, and then who is leading that initiative, where the leadership comes from, what the vision is of that leadership, if it's at all possible.
Good, thank you very much. I'll take one more on this side and then there'll be a group over here, I see. So there's one to ask. If you just wait for the microphone just 1 second so that particularly so those following this online can hear your question.
Huge problems have been created by the use of the word terrorism to one section of people and not to the states that create the rebels or something like that. The states should be questioned by the UN, but the human rights violators gang up together and prevent their terrorism being attacked by the principles of the organizations. So now, if taking Sri Lanka, I want to know if the fact that a lot of learned Sinhalese, lawyers, professors, justices have been going and telling lessons learned and Reconciliation Commission recently that successive governments from the time of independence till today have been politically and economically oppressing the ethnic minorities. Will that make a change in the cases that are going on now? Cases are being taken even 30 months after the LTTE was wiped out.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fine, we've got specific Sri Lanka experience. I just need, if I may, and this will apply to everybody, just your name and any organisation you're representing here. Could you just, if I have the microphone back for that, I should have asked for that. We had yours, Khalid.
This is Women for Justice and Peace in Sri Lanka.
And your name, please?
Selvaratnam.
Thank you very much. Did I have your name? I did, yeah. Okay, who wants to, what I think we'll do is, we won't have everybody answer everything, but those of you who would like to take up, first of all, the specific points raised in that first group of questions.
There was one that, yeah, I can say.
Yeah, and then we'll come back to your answering that.
Okay, maybe just to reply to Yesha, there is, I mean, we've talked about some of the initiatives that are already taking place. I mean, clearly the ISC has been very active on, trying to stimulate a debate. We co-hosted a roundtable with NRC, for the humanitarian space working group back in February. The roundtable summary is on the web, is available. There was a very, actually more open discussion that there has been at other meetings, I would say, around the issue, and has, also led to more action being taken within the ISC as a follow-up to these actions. In the US, there is quite a lot of work that has been led by HPCR, that's Humanitarian Policy and Conflict Research, that's at Harvard. They have a specific working group on criminalizing humanitarian engagement. We also, collaborating, closely with them, and they have they catalyze the debate in the US and collect quite a large number of academic organizations and academic institutions, humanitarian organizations, to try and take the issues forward in the US.
And so that means that both field level vis-a-vis governments and also at government head office level, there's a concerted move.
No, we said that clearly in the report. There is something that we're, for sort of obviously shortage of time, I couldn't really touch on. There is a huge disconnect between the headquarters and the country level.
And the question that prompted that for those following this online is, at what level is all this happening? So thank you very much indeed. Do you want to respond particularly to
absolutely.
Khalid Nadim's?
Okay, Khalid, thank you for your question.
Yeah.
I think as pointed out, overall, this has increased the administrative burdens on the organisation to spend more of its limited resources, the organisation's limited resources, on ensuring that we're up to speed, building capacity, have the mechanisms. Software alone can cost up to $25,000 that has to be renewed annually to ensure that we're putting all the donors through that, through those lists and the likes, as it were, of course. And when money is tight and we're in difficult circumstances, we should try and strike a balance between putting money into the administrative functions that ensure that we're fully legally and financially compliant. With regards to, Pakistan, there's an added dimension to that. I mean, we're not necessarily facing great amount of difficulties in operating in Pakistan, primarily because of our relationships that we've been able to establish in northern areas and the likes that are affected. But when we're operating on a global scale with a name like Islamic Relief, sometimes alarm bells start ringing. But we've learned to live with that over the course of the last 10 years, and now we're at a stage where we're trying to get on with a core business.
And before I get one of you, whoever wants to take up the specific issue of Sri Lanka, we've actually had from our online audience from Balachandran Gautaman, who's currently an independent consultant, but formerly with Oxfam Australia in Sri Lanka, I think. And the question on Sri Lanka from Balachandran is this: did you in the research explore donor perspectives on the reality of listed, unlisted terror groups splitting, parts of it joining the government forces as paramilitaries, etc.? In the absence of short and medium term exit clauses for listed terrorist organizations, how do you look at dealing with yesterday's terrorist, today turned humanitarian actor in a local NGO situation? So could you take those two together, really? That online question plus the question.
I think both the questions, the question from the participant in the room and the online question, highlight exactly the problem for humanitarian organisations being co-opted into this counter-terrorism struggle, which is that it's obviously a very political designation. Generally the losing side is designated the terrorist side. And the struggle for humanitarian actors is to be perceived as neutral and not to be taking a side in the conflict. So I think these are very relevant questions, and that's exactly why the humanitarian sector is so concerned not to be seen as part of a counter-terrorist struggle, because the designation of terrorist shifts and it's extremely politically loaded. So.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, more questions please. And we have a group here. Bring a microphone round. First of all to you, sir. Again, if you could just give your name and your organisation.
Ajay Madiwale, British Red Cross. I guess this question is for Kate McIntosh in particular, but anyone who can answer it would be great. From what I've understood generally, and also from your presentation, is that the Holder versus Humanitarian Law project represented a sort of test case for this issue, and obviously the results were not very encouraging. And I was wondering whether any other test cases are being planned, prepared, or in the works in other jurisdictions besides the US, in the UK or in Australia or anywhere else.
Not that I'm aware of, so I'm very happy to hear if anybody else knows about that. At the moment, the appeal, though, in the Holy Land Foundation case, which we didn't discuss in detail, but was a very major case. The Holy Land Foundation was the biggest Islamic charity in the US at the time. It was disbanded and its directors were imprisoned for terms of up to 60 years for sending funds to Zakat committees in OPT. So that appeal on that case is pending now in the US. So I think that will be the next interesting bit of legislation which will examine how the laws apply to humanitarian action, but that's again in the US. I don't know, maybe James knows more about anything in the UK or...
The ones in the UK have been dealt with by the Charity Commission.
Yes, if you just take the microphone, it's just, James should take it, it's just to make sure people following this online can do so. You need the microphone, thank you.
Just to say that the cases in the UK tend to be dealt with by the Charity Commission, which has a much more supportive way of looking at charities than US courts do. But with Holder, I doubt that test cases will really be any better, and the Supreme Court has influence in other common law jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you, Christine. And there was a question behind you. I'm taking some from the side of the room. This gentleman there.
Mine is a comment, not a question.
Fine.
I have not read this report that
if
is...
you wouldn't mind, just your name and
Robert
the
Shedden is
organisation
my name. I'm an independent spectator here. And my comment is that without having read the report, which is about to be published, it appears to me that all the high-level thinking does not survive political or judicial reality. For instance, the definition of terrorism, first given by the first speaker, brings the Libyan rebels firmly into the category of terrorists. Humanitarian aid delivered by NATO is formally prohibited by that definition. It would be much more in line with the definition of humanitarian aid if medical assistance were delivered to both sides in that conflict. Second example is that I see little or no evidence of humanitarian relief being delivered to the citizens of Gaza, who are in what is little better than a concentration camp. I know they get money, but they can't feed themselves or their animals on money. What they need is building materials, medical supplies, and a route out. And the third example, and my last example, is homegrown. In delivering judgment for the appellant in the House of Lords, the appellant appealing against 96 days detention without trial, Lord Hoffman said, "The greatest threat to the liberty in this country is not terrorism, but laws like this."
Thank you very much, Ian. As you said, comment. But while we did have another go at Peter. Yeah.
Peter Gill, I'm a freelance journalist. I wonder whether panelists, particularly the writers of the report, could comment further on the role and the stance of the major INGOs. We've had MSF mentioned, ICRC as a very distinct case, and we have Islamic Relief, and they've made their position very clear. What about the big boys here and in the US? Is there any sense in which they have been either co-opted into this process or at least to preserve their funds are going along with it?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's come back to our panel. I think we've got various challenges contained in both the questions and the comments indeed as well.
I'll take the question, I'll leave the comment for Kate. But the question actually, when you read the report, you realize that this is really the crux of the issues. I cannot share, what has been said in confidence to us as we were researching the report. We've interviewed a large number of the big boys, but they've all spoken on condition that this was confidential to us, could inform the report without mentioning names. We know that there is an enormous amount of work that each of the big organizations does to make sure that they comply with legislation, that they sort of don't fall foul of the counter-terrorism legislation. What they accept in terms of donor clauses is not known to us, even as a result of the study. We do know of 2 or 3 because we've had access to more private documents, which again I could not share. But generally, this is the information that does come forward. Doesn't come forward from donors, doesn't come forward from NGOs, and this is why the report stresses so much the importance of opening up the dialogue. Until we continue to be cagey and maintain this information as covert, we cannot be transparent enough. We cannot have a meaningful and constructive dialogue with the donors if we we don't say clearly the extent to which the legislation impacts on the operations. Even those who have decided to accept clauses, and I think this is probably why not enough information is shared, because some organizations will have gone along with clauses that are unpalatable for humanitarian organizations, but until we have a more transparent discussion about this, it's difficult to engage the donors in a more constructive dialogue.
Okay. Do you want to take up?
I mean,
maybe either the question or the comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comments is, those are again valid points. I think they go, they're a particular perspective on some of the issues that we've raised, indeed, in the report. I don't think I have much more to add other than to say, I think you'll find some of those views reflect in the analysis that we've been able to do as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. More questions? Back over here, and back to the gentleman at the back there, and then work our way forward. Yes, thank you very much.
My name is Silman Rahal, the director of Nubab Survival Foundation. My question to Sarah Pantaleano. I would like to ask, is the international humanitarian laws ineffective? Is it effective? I mean, the case in Sudan, when you see that since last June, when the war broke out, the Nuba were caught in that situation, and they were even pushed right up to the mountain, and the government has denied the humanitarian assistance at all to any humanitarian agency to go to the area, and people are now living in caves with no humanitarian assistance. Do you think that the international law in this can intervene when the massive report about the genocide has been committed in the Nuba Mountain?
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, before we move forward, I think we'll just take that one specifically, because I think it does address a very important, and indeed before I let you respond, so I'm going to ask Mona to just comment on that question as well, to answer that question, if I may. And I think it's the same sort of thing as something I was posing right at the beginning, isn't it? Which strikes me too. You can have all the negotiations and what seems to be a perfect mandate, but if a government or governments flatly refuse to do anything about it, what do you do? Do you compromise or walk away? What do you do? Do you want to take it first? And then
I mean, I think there's several pieces to that in terms of compromising on the fundamental principles for aid agencies. The ICRC would definitely be against that. Now, your question directly about whether international law works because of the violations you speak of or the difficulties which the civilian populations are facing, I think it's not a question of the failure of international humanitarian law as such. It's a question of non-implementation, which has obvious political dimensions. governments and state authorities responsible for territories have a legal responsibility to ensure that the civilian population under their control have the basic humanitarian necessities to sustain life. Now, if they're unable or unwilling to do so, again, according to IHL, other agencies, including neutral and partial humanitarian aid agencies, have the right to move in and do so themselves. The difficulties and challenges we've been speaking of today are just another layer of complexity and challenges in the face of humanitarian actors in reaching those populations in need. We would suggest that in situations of armed conflict, there is not a need to have this other set of regulations, which are the counter-terrorist regulations. We would suggest that international humanitarian law is a sufficient body of law to govern in situations of armed conflict.
Okay. Good. Sorry, but do you want to come back on that? On that answer from Mona?
I would say, I mean, because the international community has been involved in this case for a long time, because of the violation, the grave human right violation was taking place in the area, and they were calling on there was UNMS in the area, who even the report has indicated that the violation has committed, and that means, and now the people, because they missed out the agriculture period, and they're going to face grave, what do you call it, hunger, or in the coming few months' time. Okay. Because there will not be, they haven't grown anything at all. So in that case, I think the humanitarian assistance is most important.
One has been very clear. I mean, I think the issue is what happens when a government is unable or unwilling, to provide assistance with citizens, and what happens at that point is, who is unable to intervene and how can they intervene, and so, the role of the UN and other partners. So there's a bigger discussion taking place around the political willingness to, engage with the situation in southern Kordofan and in Blue Line, to which you're referring at the moment, and what is driving that inaction, if you want. And there is a lot of work that is happening in the background but is not apparent, but there are efforts to try and secure the humanitarian assistance going in, I can assure you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And just before we do pick up again in this area, we had another online question from Amjad Salim of the Cordoba Foundation, who said this: having been in the United States over the last few weeks talking to lawyers about this issue, it's clear that the laws, particularly in the United States, have been viewed through a security lens. And my question is, how do you bridge the gap between a political agenda and a security agenda? How can NGOs work more closely with each other to counter the... Sorry, just before that, essential to this, organisations working with local actors in Gaza, with the university there, are put on a blacklist of terror funding organisations, for example. Therefore, secondly, how can NGOs work more closely with each other to counter this and empower the local communities? Is this sustainable, particularly in terms of the funding? So we'll hold that question from our online audience in our minds, and indeed invite more from those following this online, but also add one or two more questions and comments here.
Just a question. My name's Chris Rush from Geneva Call. It's a question for Sarah, and it follows on from, I think, from discussion about IHL. I think you were curtailed during your presentation, but one of your recommendations was in relation to reframing the debate in terms of IHL, and I'm actually interested to know more about how you envisage doing that. Thank you.
And we'll take that one. Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. Well, actually, I think Kate can elaborate on this even better than I do. But I think the feeling with us, sort of, thinking about what recommendations to put in the report is that in a way. Both proponents of counter-terrorism laws and humanitarian actors share the same commitment to protect civilians from attacks. And so at the same time, the same donors they introduce and promote counter-terrorism laws would recognize the protection and assistance. This commitment needs to be provided in an impartial manner. So these are elements that are commonly shared by both those who propose counter-terrorism laws and humanitarian organizations, and that's why we feel that if we reframe the discussion under sort of the provisions of IHL, that can lead to a more constructive engagement, because ultimately there are goals that are shared, there are interests and concerns that are common, and we feel that at least to start a dialogue, it would be a useful way of framing the issue, to take it forward. And you can add more about it.
Well, exactly that. But also, IHL, and I think Mona's already referred to this in her response to the last question about Sudan. But IHL itself is developed as something which balances security interests and the humanitarian imperative. I mean, that's what IHL is about. It's meant to be, it's something which is acceptable to warring parties because it recognises their legitimate interest in trying to win a conflict, and yet it balances that with the principle of humanity. So the provisions of IHL already provide a compromise between these two agendas, which we're seeing again come head to head in this whole issue.
And there was that in part of your response to Amjad Salim's question.
So I was
as well,
looking over your shoulder at that, and I think for us that's exactly the way to try and bridge this gap. We understand that it's completely futile for the humanitarian community to disregard the security interests of states and their obligations to protect their populations from terrorist attacks. But IHL provides a framework and a language in which all those interests can be balanced. So we suggest it as a conceptual way to try and move forward on this issue.
Lovely. Let's move forward ourselves.
I apologise.
Could you just wait for the microphone and just identify yourself?
All right, okay. Irene Bag. I work in international law, but I also spent several years in northern Iraq prior to the recent war. And I'm currently doing research into internal displacement and conflict where it affects women and children. First of all, I think that it is a little bit naive not to consider that any parties involved in the conflict are going to try and get what they see as visible resources that are coming in, no matter how it is coming in. And therefore NGOs, from my experience, having had to deal with the pressures that are put on NGOs to actually divert materials and resources, it is to be perfectly open to both sides and to explain that in fact when factions try and authorities, whether they be de facto or legitimate, try and divert resources for their own purposes, it actually internationally undermines their own credibility if they are seeking such credibility, such as independent statehood or recognition or whatever. And so, but you can only do this if as has been said by the Norwegian Refugee Council, that you can only do this if you have a level of trust and understanding. It isn't impossible, but it is difficult, and advocacy and diplomatic skills are required. My second observation is that I am concerned that there's the number of displaced women and children, families, is increasing all the time. Until recently, there was actually no international recognition for internally displaced persons. That is being remedied gradually, and there is a special rapporteur for internal displacement within the UN system. However, if in curtailing and diminishing access to humanitarian resources and aid for people who are caught in areas of conflict, then undermines the rights for children and women, for example, access to education. What is being created are whole generations who would have known nothing but war and conflict, being in camps, not being educated. When they become teenagers, such youngsters will know nothing else but to get involved in conflict. And so, to me...
Sorry, just to interrupt you. And you link that to some extent to the increasing scale of counter-terrorism measures.
Yes, I can understand that there is a need for counter-terrorism. But what I'm trying to say is that the legislation has got to be pragmatic. There has got to be room for discussion, and there has got to be room for negotiation. So if you are curtailing dispute resolution and conflict resolution measures and the work of such organizations who will provide a way in for dialogue, then really essentially you are discriminating against children and women and stopping their rights to a productive life.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your point. Jahangir,
yes,
I saw you nodding vigorously there.
I mean, it's a very valid point. In a world of increasingly difficult humanitarian access, you know, we're going to make it increasingly difficult. It's already difficult to get to those places, as we've mentioned earlier. And what we're doing now is making it more difficult to get to. And what kind of world does that create, in which that only these people are left in the camps and in that kind of environment where nobody, where very few people can reach, and those that can reach are so scared. Because of what's potentially likely to happen, not scared but curtailed as such, then this is not the kind of environment that we're trying to foster, and one that we are promoting, as in this panel and in the report, is openness, transparency, dialogue and the likes, as it were, so that we can all be upfront and we don't have to hide behind our comments in reports and the likes. We need to come out, and I welcome, for example, the recent parliamentary sort of select committee as an example as to how we bring things out in the open, even from government's point of view, when government-to-government funding is taking place, as it were. So I think there's got to be a greater push towards this. Otherwise, we are looking at a darker world, unfortunately.
I think the women and children are the victims of war.
Absolutely.
They are innocent victims of war.
Absolutely.
And to criminalize them indirectly and to disaffect them so indirectly is wrong. And measures and approaches have to be made in the ways forward. So
thank you very much. No, point you made very strongly indeed. Absolutely.
It's absolutely right. And the over two-thirds of the beneficiaries, for example, the one that I visited, I saw out in Somalia were women and children, at least two-thirds of that. And so those are the ones that are the most vulnerable, are going to be the most affected as a result of this.
Absolutely. Hands have been up for a while. Sorry. Here and over there, and I've now seen one or two over there. So we'll do a group of about 4 probably.
Okay, my name is Sandrine Tiller. I'm from MSF. I just actually, it's probably more of a comment. I really think this is a very timely paper. I know you haven't focused exclusively on the UK. In fact, it doesn't sound like you mentioned UK policy very much. But just to say that, I mean, we've been working on that issue and in dialogue with DFID and the Foreign Office, and certainly there exists a kind of, I guess, two brains approach of the British government, which is to have the sanctions and prescription of Shabab in place, and all kinds of sanctions regimes, as well as then having the humanitarian policy in place, which emphasizes aid being given on need alone, and the principles of neutrality.
And do you think that's workable?
Impartiality. It's not workable in practice, and the DFID still maintains that there's a zero leakage policy. That is, if one of your trucks gets hijacked, you know, you are liable. But of course, then they say, "Don't worry, we're not prosecuting. We're not sitting around waiting to prosecute NGOs." So it's a very complex position, and to be honest, I think in the UK we haven't yet really explored the issue. So it's just a comment there.
No, thank you for your comment too. While the microphone's over there, could we just go right over to the gentleman in the corner there, and the lady there?
Okay. I better stand up, I suppose, in the corner. Peter Tesh, I work in Mauritania. I have a question for...
Would any particular organisation be helpful to know about?
Well, different organisations, but I work with Mauritanian groups and including the government. So, okay. I have a question for Mona, for Sarah, and for Kate. But I don't think the question is not only that Western government, US in particular, is trying to get this black and white and good and bad victims. Certain advocacy NGOs are also pushing that agenda. We have seen it in Ivory Coast, where there's good victims and bad victims, and Ouattara is good, Gbagbo is bad. We have seen it certainly still going on in Libya, where certain victims are good and bad, and we have seen the results with in particular black Libyans and people from neighboring countries being victimized. And after all, Libya was a humanitarian intervention. So I know this is humanitarian intervention is a different agenda, but it just touches on, and enough the advocacy NGO enough who originated from Save Darfur has been very vociferous, I would say belligerent, in relation to Somalia. So I would like to have thoughts about that.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, my friends with you, and then over there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Samir Hawari from HPG. I have a question for Mona and for Jahangir. Basically, one thing that came out when doing the research for the study was the lack of donor consistency. So they might scrutinize some contexts much more than they scrutinize others. And I was just wondering whether, to what extent that has been your experience in terms of the way donors have engaged with the way, for example, you operate in Afghanistan compared to Somalia, or Somalia compared to Colombia, for example.
Thank you very much indeed. And you still got a question? Yes? Yep, we'll get a microphone to you. No, it was Lisa.
Thanks. Lisa Denny from ODI. I just had a question about the sort of impact of counterterrorism on humanitarian action overall. A lot of the other literature I've come across has spoken about how counterterrorism, or the effect has actually been that there's been more aid given to situations like Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was interested in, Sarah, in your presentation, you were saying that in some of the volatile contexts you're looking at, it's actually been characterized by less overall assistance. So I was just wondering how these two sort of dynamics are playing out against each other.
Thank you very much indeed. What I think we'll do, there's quite a lot of substance in all of those questions and comments. And actually, following up one of those, I would just add in, I've been intrigued to know what, you use the word donors scrutinizing what humanitarian organizations are up to. I don't know if anybody's got any evidence of what they actually gain from it. What have they learnt? Any practical examples any of you might have of what, in this whole process, under the label of counterterrorism scrutiny, do we know what kind of things, and whatever they have learned, what have they done with the information? I wonder if we could kind of get practical in any way. Anybody who's got an experience of that? And if so, whether you're satisfied with that process or whether you're alarmed by it at all. So that's just to add into that selection. And what I'll do, because we are now almost at our close, is just use that collection of questions just to go around all of you. Actually, I know you weren't selected out by Peter, but let's include you as well. So we'll start at that end with Mona, if you would, drawing on any of those final questions.
Okay, to answer perhaps the gentleman's question, I absolutely agree. It's not a question of saying that all humanitarian agencies have all acted within principled action and that they've never made mistakes. That's absolutely not the message here. I think the IHL prescriptions for a humanitarian agency going in and supporting and carrying out assistance is that they be humanitarian, impartial, and act without adverse distinction. So the humanitarian community has to also uphold the fundamental principles of impartiality and independence and neutrality, and carry out activities and assistance according to need, and clearly mistakes have been made in the past. Just a quick comment on Libya and the term humanitarian intervention there, which the ICRC would have an issue with. To us, we qualify the situation as being both an international armed conflict and a non-international armed conflict going on in parallel. Your question, Samir, on donors and on the difference in perhaps difficulty in securing funding. Yes, clearly there are contexts which are more complicated and difficult to secure funding. In terms of emergency appeals, we've often found this in situations which come to mind. It's been mentioned a lot, Somalia, Gaza. I won't go into details in terms of the actual negotiations with individual donors, but yes, we clearly do see some contexts as being much more problematic and difficult to secure funding for than others.
Thank you. John Gill.
Okay. I can't comment on the level of donor scrutiny other organizations have had, but of course our experience has been one that there's been a sizable increase of donor scrutiny that we've had, as mentioned in this panel, come up to scratch with in terms of where the funding comes from, where it goes, through ensuring that we're not giving that over to prescribed organizations and the likes as well. So our knowledge and understanding tells us that, again, I don't want to keep playing or using Islamic NGO card, but I think the Islamic NGOs have found it somewhat very challenging under the last decade of trying to be able to, again, engage in humanitarian action. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the recent events in Somalia are evidence to say Somalia also some in Libya, definitely in Pakistan, to show a re-emergence of some of these Islamic NGOs or Islamic charitable wings from the Gulf that are coming to play a part in the humanitarian sector, which I think is a welcome addition, because there might be greater opportunity for negotiation, discussion, discourse, as it were, where other traditional humanitarian actors may have struggled. So if we can bring as many humanitarian actors around the table, we're trying to ensure that we abide upon the core principles of the humanitarian activism or humanitarian action, then we've got a stronger chance of achieving through deadlocks and making breakthroughs in situations like Somalia and potentially around the corner Yemen and the likes.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Yes, well, I think I'll come back on the question about which is a really good point. I think that's very interesting. So you're referring to the idea that aid is increasingly used as part of stabilisation programs and so on. I mean, I think that's exactly the other side of the coin. I mean, the effect is that both are about co-opting aid somehow into politics and channeling where the situations you're talking about, increased aid being diverted, increased aid being provided, that would be to support the favoured party, and aid to the disfavoured party / terrorist organisation is then being blocked. So I think it's two sides of the same coin. The point is that in both cases, it's no longer impartial, a neutral aid that's being delivered. It's being aid that's following a particular political intervention strategy, and that's what we're complaining about.
And just to add, I mean, Kate has preempted what I was going to say, but my conclusion, which I didn't manage to make earlier, but I think is very relevant now, is exactly that, we see a trend which, the impact of counter-terrorism legislation accentuates in seeing that established humanitarian providers are increasingly seen as agents of Western governments. And this is a fundamental problem in undermining the legitimacy and the acceptance of humanitarian response in many of these crises. And this is why, we have worked on this policy brief and why we feel that, this dialogue, open and constructive dialogue, is really urgent.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think we've had, from my perspective, an extremely interesting, extremely revealing discussion in many ways about an immensely important and topical issue. One phrase that I jotted down from it that will certainly stick with me, this may have been an on-the-record discussion, but I don't think it discouraged anybody from being full and frank and free. And the one of those I jotted down was this: at times I feel like giving people's money back. Interesting, Jahangir. Which is a pretty alarming thought, isn't it, in the midst of all this? But thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who are here in this room with us and all of those who've been following it online. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. Thank all the speakers for their contributions. And
thank you.